How did a young woman of just 20 end up all over national news for her brutal death? Likely one of the most famous true crime cases involving Playboy is that of Dorothy Stratten. Born Dorothy Hope Hugh Stratten, Dorothy didn't think much of her looks, at least according to her sister Louise. She was teased and bullied, and Dorothy just knew that she never wanted to make anyone feel the way she had felt growing up, and her goal in life was just to be a good person. It was this goodness in her that would attract many flies to her light, and some question if it was this goodness that would result in her ultimate end. Dorothy was born February 28, 1960 in Vancouver, Canada, and at just 16 years old, she was working at the local Dairy Queen. One night, a man almost 10 years older than her, Paul Snider, would walk into the shop, ultimately changing both of their lives forever. Paul was known around the area for coercing women into sex work, and Dorothy's boss, seeing how Paul was taken by her, had warned her against him. Dorothy's boss talks on and on about how sweet, kind, and shy she was. So when he saw Paul coming, he really tried to keep her away from him. But it just wouldn't work. Paul Snider was known in Vancouver as kind of a small-time hustler, club promoter, and it was just obvious to everyone how desperate he was for success. So when Snider saw Dorothy, he saw a meal ticket. It wasn't just her looks. It was her innocence. It radiated off of her, and he was very attracted to it. Paul arranged for a photo shoot with Dorothy and then sent the shots in to Playboy. Then, at just barely 18, Dorothy was flown out to LA, and that is where she would meet Hugh Hefner, and her life would hit the fast track. It wasn't just Paul Snider who saw something in Dorothy. Hugh Hefner and director Peter Bogdanovich set their eyes on the innocent young blonde with the hopes of making her into a star. While Dorothy was navigating an entirely new world at Playboy, Paul was waiting on the outside, watching the woman he believed he found begin to make a name for herself and successfully win over the hearts of everyone she met. Paul inserted himself into the world of Playboy as quickly as he could as Dorothy's manager. He accompanied her to parties and events, and while the people of Playboy tolerated Paul, he was far from welcomed into the fold.
Anything that you might say about Dorothy, the opposite was true of Paul. In other words, Dorothy made this incredible impression. Everybody loved her, and almost everyone was universally put off by Paul.
Paul and Dorothy would marry, some believing that this was Paul's attempt to keep her money, and her success tied to him. Now, keep in mind that I'm looking at this case from almost 50 years into the future. But in the world of social media, so many of us are becoming educated about different types of toxic relationships. Seeing Dorothy's story from a 2025 point of view, it's sadly almost textbook what is occurring here. Similar to men like Andrew Tate, Snider clearly defined his value as a man as the ability to control the women around him and their ability to make him money. We see this in his early days in Canada, acting as a manager for sex workers, and we see it again with his instantaneous goal of making Dorothy a playmate. As the relationship began to suffer, as Dorothy became more and more successful, he is starting to lose the thing that he decided gives him value: his control over Dorothy and her affection. Now, Marilyn Grabowski would tell eBiography that she bought Dorothy a puppy. Dorothy apparently was so in love with this puppy that Paul complained she loved the dog more than she loved him. And unfortunately, the puppy would not survive the month.
So I gave her a puppy, and she was thrilled. A week later, the puppy was dead. Dorothy had made one statement to me during this week that she had the puppy. She said, "Paul thinks I love the puppy more than him." I'm sure he killed the dog. And if that wasn't a wake-up call to all of us, it should have been.
As Dorothy began getting offered more and more opportunities, including movies, the spotlight was trained solely on her, not Snider. She would land roles in movies like Galaxina and They All Laughed with John Ritter and Audrey Hepburn. It was becoming more and more obvious to everybody that Dorothy had the ability to be America's next sweetheart. This is one thing I think men like Paul never see coming. They want the attention of controlling beautiful women. They all want to be the next Hugh Hefner, right? They want the attention of look how big of a man they are based off all the women they can control. Once Paul realized that Dorothy was the star and not him, the relationship would suffer. Dorothy became Playmate of the Year, further launching her into the limelight.
Made me probably the happiest girl in the world today. Thank you.
During that particular day, it was clear that there was trouble between her and Paul. She was kind of avoiding it. There's also a moment in which she is going through a book of pictures, and he puts his hand on her and she pulls it away.
Dorothy would separate from Paul and begin dating director Peter Bogdanovich while working on the movie They All Laughed with John Ritter. Bogdanovich said the movie was filmed and directed in a way to mimic how he had fallen in love with Dorothy. I can only imagine how Dorothy is feeling right now. She have come from a small town, has found instant success with Playboy. She is being validated. She is being told how wonderful and kind and beautiful and amazing she is. She's falling in love. She's now been cast opposite of John Ritter and Audrey Hepburn. I can't imagine Dorothy thinking her life could be any better than it is now. Sadly, there was still the matter of her ex-husband, Paul Snider. Paul apparently was threatening Dorothy and everyone in her life.
On July 30th, 1980, Dorothy Stratten and Peter Bogdanovich returned to Los Angeles. Paul Snider was waiting for them.
And he said he had gone over to Bogdanovich's house and was waiting for him, and he never showed up, so he just fired 2 rounds at his house.
And many told her to stay away from him. Clearly, he was unhinged. But Dorothy felt like it was the right, good thing to do to give Paul a face-to-face conversation about their relationship. August 14th, 1980, while with her sister Louise, Dorothy decided it was time to talk to Paul. Louise was supposed to go with Dorothy that day, but instead she was dropped off at the beach, expecting that her sister would pick her up in just a few hours. Louise was 16 and Dorothy was 20. Sadly, the beach would be the last time the sisters saw each other. It is believed that when Dorothy went to Paul's that day, he would assault her and end her life before turning the gun onto himself. Their bodies would later be found by roommates. It was Hugh Hefner who would reach out to Peter Bogdanovich to give him the news of the incident. And surprisingly, it would be grief that would turn these 2 men against each other, each blaming each other for Dorothy's death. Peter Bogdanovich blamed Hugh Hefner for bringing her into the world of Playboy, stealing away her innocence, and Hugh Hefner would blame Peter Bogdanovich for plunging her into the world of Hollywood. Peter Bogdanovich would later publish a book titled The Killing of a Unicorn. He would blame Hugh Hefner for her death in that book. Hugh Hefner would then accuse Peter Bogdanovich of sleeping with 16-year-old Louise, and basically these 2 men just could not stop pointing fingers in regards to Dorothy's death. It is my personal opinion that both of these men needed the catharsis of being angry at someone and taking their anger out. However, Paul Snider was gone, so they had to take it out on each other. Playboy would move on, but not after publishing an issue featuring Dorothy's story. Peter Bogdanovich would also move on. Dorothy's sister Louise would change her last name to Stratten, and her and Peter Bogdanovich would marry. So let's take a look at some of Dorothy's work. Dorothy would first land in the pages of Playboy in August 1979 as a centerfold. This was a classic centerfold spread highlighting her background and her photos. Then, in 1980, Dorothy would get Playmate of the Year, giving her the June cover. This would be a 10-page spread celebrating Dorothy's popularity within the Playboy world. Then, after her death in May 1981, Playboy would release a 20-page in-depth piece on Dorothy's life, everything from her upbringing to her tragic end. There would be multiple movies on her life, including the movie Star 80 from 1938, as well as the movie Death of a Centerfold in 1981 featuring Jamie Lee Curtis. There would also be books on her life, including The Killing of the Unicorn by Peter Bogdanovich and Death of a Playmate by Teresa Carpenter. I was able to get my hands on a copy of her final movie with Peter Bogdanovich, They All Laughed, featuring her, John Ritter, and Audrey Hepburn, as well as the movie featuring Jamie Lee Curtis as Dorothy that released very shortly after her death. Now it's time for an ad break. If you would like to own the collection that I used to film this video, including the 3 Playboys that include Dorothy, her original centerfold, her Playmate of the Year, and the issue featuring her story after her death, along with 2 DVDs, one a copy of They All Laughed by Peter Bogdanovich, and a copy of Jamie Lee Curtis in Death of a Centerfold. Check out the link in this video description or scan the QR code. Bunny's gotta eat too. It is my personal opinion that the 3 men in Dorothy's life wanted one thing: to own her. Snider had her in marriage, Bogdanovich had her in love, and Heth had her in print. Paul would ultimately take away her life, ending her ability to ever live for herself. Bogdanovich, some believe, in an attempt to hold on to Dorothy longer, would do so through her little sister. Over the years since her passing, various stories will come out, some claiming horrific abuse at the hands of Hefner, others saying that the staff had tried to warn the magazine editor of Paul. Ultimately, we'll never know the truth about those things. Many believe, including Hugh Hefner, that Dorothy's death would signal the end of the free-loving era of the 1970s. Some questioned if she would have gained further star power had she not been murdered at such a young age, or if, like many playmates, her fame would be fleeting. I would love to know your thoughts in the comments. Where do you think Dorothy would be today? Sadly, something I notice in a lot of discussion about Dorothy is that it seems to be focused on what everybody else wanted for her. Paul wanted her to make money for him, Bogdanovich wanted her in movies, Hef wanted her in Playboy, but we never got a real sense of what Dorothy wanted out of life. What were her goals before she met Snider? What did she think her life would be? Dorothy's death would lead to an increased awareness of domestic violence and the exploitation of women in Hollywood. Dorothy Stratten's story reminds us of the dangers of unchecked power dynamics and the vulnerability of young women navigating industries that can often exploit them. I think the best thing we can do is remember Dorothy for all that she was. She was a happy, kind, sweet person who never wanted anyone to feel as small and belittled as she once did. All right, bunnies. See you next week. Bye.